So without further ado, let's kick off with our first pair of speakers. So it's Emeline Levasseur and André Falut from the National Archives of France. And they are data migration and digital preservation managers at the National Archives. So they have an easy life, I'm sure, very straightforward job, no problems at all. But they're here to share a couple of their workflows with us today. The first one will be about mailbox archiving and a workflow on that, and then a second one about data preparation. And as Sarah's just said, we're going to pause for questions between the two, so we can sort of concentrate on each workflow as it's described. So we're starting off with the mailbox archiving workflow, and I'm going to pass over now to Emeline and André, if that's okay. Are you ready for us, guys?
We're ready.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much.
I'm gonna share a screen.
Yeah, I'm
Screen one, and here we go. So you
Perfect. I can see the slides. Yeah.
Thank you. So hello everyone. Good morning from Paris, France, where it's 10 in the morning and kind of cloudy weather.
yeah, it's overcast.
Thank you for this introduction. André and I indeed work at the French National Archives as project managers for data migration and for the digital preservation strategy. We are truly delighted to be able to present you two workflows today, the first one on email archiving and the second on data preparation. And we really like to thank the DPC for having us today and for organizing this webinar series. Really thank you. We will start with our first one, our mailbox strategy archiving workflow. To do so, we are first going to give an overview of the context so that you can understand the choices we made. We will then focus on the principle and the implementations of the workflow itself. And finally, we'd like to discuss the limitations we faced and our broader reflection and experiments around mailboxes.
So to start with a few words on our institutional context, the National Archives were created during the French Revolution, and they are a national public service tasked with organizing, preserving, providing access to, and promoting public archives from the central administrations of state, and they perform the same missions for private archives of national interests. Within the Digital Support and Preservation Division, the Department of Data Administration, our department is tasked with preserving digital archives. So the National Archives received public archives through archivists working with central administrations within structures called archive missions, and between collecting records and transferring those destined for historical preservation to the National Archives, mission archivists appraise and arrange them. So archive missions are not subordinated to the National Archives. They are overseen by the Interministerial Service of French Archives, the CIAF, which also oversees, as such, they are on the same level as the National Archives within the French Public Archives network. So the National Archives missions are restricted to historical archiving, meaning that all records transferred to the National Archives are meant to be preserved indefinitely.
As for a technical and normative context, since November 2018, born digital archives are preserved within the National Archive Digital Repository, which is based on a VITAM back office and interfaced with our own front office, which is the in-house archival information system. You may know VITAM. It's an open source software developed within the initial sponsorship of 3 French ministries, the Ministries of Culture, Defense, and Foreign Affairs. The VITAM program has since expanded to involve over 50 partners, I think. VITAM uses a standard called CEDA, for Data Exchange Standard for Archiving, that it could be considered as the French counterpart of METS. The first version of CEDA was published in 2006, and the last version, the CEDA 2.2, was released in 2022. I hope that we've made the context clearer, but now let's move on to our mailbox archiving workflow, its principle and its practical implementation.
So to give you an overview of mailbox archiving at the National Archives, digital archiving at the National Archives goes back to the early 80s, but they only started collecting mailboxes at a fairly recent date. There was a first early experiment in 2011, and a few mailboxes were collected from 2017 onwards, but they only started collecting mailboxes in earnest in 2020. And as mentioned earlier, they are focused exclusively on definitive archiving. So the archives we receive have already been selected and assessed by archivists in missions. The National Archives only conduct these operations in very specific cases. So for internally produced archives and for archives in for digital archives in private archives. So mailboxes are generally transferred to the digital repository from ministries' offices, along with other digital records. A majority of the mailboxes we collect are in PSC, as Outlook is very widely used in the central administrations of states. So we've also received some mailboxes, some Thunderbird mailboxes, so in Mbox format. We've only ingested the PST files to the digital repository so far. Individual messages may also be preserved among the other files from a given desktop, but this strategy we are presenting today is meant to preserve mailboxes preserved as a whole. While the first mailbox was collected in 2011, this strategy was only developed in 2019, and since then it's been used to process 41 PST files from 40 different mailboxes, and those are now preserved in the digital repository. There is a stock of 95 PST files and 7 mailboxes in Mbox that haven't been processed nor migrated to the digital repository yet.
We will now present you the workflow itself, starting with its goals and its principle. Of course, the first aim of our workflow is really to ensure preservation of the messages of a mailbox, their arrangement, their metadata, or a selection of them, as well as their attachments. Regarding access, it also makes it possible to search and find these messages in the digital repository, where the messages are displayed as a tree structure, and André will show you that a little later in our presentation. But you have to keep in mind that in 2019, as we were conceiving this workflow, we hadn't had any request for access yet, and why we could think of hypothetical use cases. We were very aware of the lack of time-tested experience in accessing archived mailboxes. Therefore, our strategy had to leave room for future options to represent archives outside the digital repository. So in order to both ensure preservation and keep options for several ways of representation, the National Archives recommendation is to transfer each mailboxes to the repository as a set of 2 SIPs. The first SIP contains one or several raw exports in PST or Mbox formats as collected. This export could be used to render the mailbox through a tool capable of handling that format. Emulation could provide here an interesting perspective in that regard. Another SIP contains the individual messages extracted from the original mailbox in both EML and TXT formats, rendered in their original tree structure, with attachments extracted in the original format and linked to the messages in the tree structure on an intellectual level. This second SIP enables long-term preservation without depending on proprietary formats on the original extractions and makes content searchable and accessible in the digital repository.
And as for the practical implementation of this strategy, our main tool is Recip, an SIP preparation and mailbox extraction tool developed by the Vitam team, which allows us to extract and process a mailbox in order to obtain our preservation SIP. So Recip is used by mission archivists and archivists in national archives to process digital archives, including mailboxes, and to prepare SIPs before their ingestion to the digital repository. It is available at the link provided on the slide on the GitHub of the Vitam program. So mailbox extraction is one of the options provided in the importation drop-down menu in Recip. And the settings window for this option allows us to select the appropriate extraction protocol, here in this example Thunderbird, and the default encoding. It also allows us to extract to generate a plain text version of the message bodies, which we select in accordance to our preservation strategy. And it also provides options to generate a plain text version of attachments if relevant, and to extract textual metadata from messages and attachments. A window summarizes the extraction and importation process and results. Once the extraction and importation are complete, the mailbox contents are displayed in a tree structure view, with the root archive unit at the top and a CSV file created by Recip, which contains a list of the messages and the address book when applicable to the mailbox format. So the interface is split into 3 panels. One displays the tree structure view. Another one displays the descriptive and management metadata, and a third one gives us the technical metadata. So this here is the user-friendly view of the interface, which is in French, but there is also an XML view with the SEDA tags in English. For every extracted message, there is a mapping between the message metadata and SEDA tags, with the subject, the sender, the addressee, the client ID of the message, etc. When selecting the archive unit of a message, the technical metadata panel displays 2 objects. So the EML version of the message here as a binary master 1, and the text version of its body generated by Recip here as a text content 1. As this message had an attachment, there is a corresponding archive unit under its own, and the attachment metadata has been mapped to SEDA tags as well. After the extraction, archivists can perform technical and archival pre-ingestion tasks such as unzipping folders, deleting empty files and folders, deleting personal folders or messages, etc. Of course, these eliminations must be documented, and they do so in the custodial history of the root archival units. And these processes are facilitated by tools provided by Recip, such as a warning for empty files, a search function, and a feature to fuse duplicate objects. And to give you an example, the search functions will allow them to search for terms such as confidential. So before the extraction, Recip can be set up to exclude certain types of files according to our archival and file formats policy based on their name. So this will be either their full name or a regular expression, excluding certain extensions. For example, in this case, VCF files, which are business cards, logos in the EMZ format, or DAT files created during after a message transmission error won't be included in the import. And so once unwanted files have been eliminated, archivists can describe archive units at all the relevant levels. These will generally be high levels rather than on each message. And description metadata fields corresponding to set tags can be added as needed. Archive units can be ordered by selecting and dragging them in the tree structure panel, and the message list CSV, along with a list of acronyms, if necessary, is filed in an appendix folder. The last remaining step in RECIP is to regenerate IDs for the archive units to match their new order in the SIP. And once this is done, we can export the SIP, which can then be transferred to the digital repository. A guidance sheet summarizing the step-by-step of this process has been created as a tool for mission archivists. And after preparing the two SIPs, archivists can ingest them to the digital repository in a single entry, which will then allow for access both the raw mailbox export and the individual messages from the mailbox extracted as a tree structure and processed in RECIP. So this is the SIP of the raw PST export. As you can see, it appears as a single archive unit with no hierarchy. And this is the second SIP, which was processed in RECIP to extract individual messages and their attachments. And here we have the option to display them in a tree structure. And here is how it looks for parts of the inbox folder. And last, in an appendix, we have the CSV files created by RECIP with a list of the messages and the CSV that represents the calendar appointments. In 3 years of implementing this strategy, we have had the opportunity to consider its limitations. And following the first request for access we received, we performed some experiments that allowed us to reflect on further prospects.
First, we are very aware that this method involves a lot of time-consuming work, which largely rests on mission archivists, how they are the ones handling the exportation process and the creation of the SIPs. Second, the workflow is also dependent on a tool, which is RECIP, which has its own limitations. Depending on the size of the mailbox or the number of messages it contains, it can be the successful importation in RECIP can be quite long and time-consuming, and many errors can prevent the importation, as the process stops as soon as an importation error occurs. This error can be difficult to analyze, and importation issues have to be reported and discussed with the RECIP team. Thirdly, there is an issue regarding the maximum size of the SIPs for ingestion. Currently, archivists can only transfer SIP under 30 gigabytes in our digital repository. Beyond that size, that means that a single mailbox would have to be exported in several segments, each prepared and transferred in its own SIP. At this time, we haven't yet really encountered really big mailboxes, but we are aware that processing mailboxes bigger than 30 gigabytes will be very time-consuming. And last, after ingest, we have also experienced difficulties when it comes to render some entire extracted mailboxes in the digital archive platform. As with every archival holding ingested in our digital repository, regardless of their nature, mailboxes, their messages, and their attachments can be accessed, as you've seen, in a tree structure, just like in RECIP. But there are limitations on this tree view, in particular for displaying high numbers of messages contained in one and same folder, something we might find in roughly organized mailboxes. In such cases, it won't be possible to display all the messages contained in these folders. Over the past year, our first request for access led us to experiment with ways to investigate and potentially give access to an archive mailbox. This request involved, unfortunately, a mailbox that couldn't be imported successfully in a RECIP, and as a consequence, couldn't be ingested into our digital repository. Therefore, it's a very specific use case, but these technical obstacles have led us to experiment with other tools than RECIP in order to access the mailbox ourselves so that we could investigate the request. Indeed, an investigation was necessary since in France, there is a delay of minimum 50 years before the mailboxes, we call it, are publicly accessible. Requests for access to this record therefore require a specific authorization depending on the presence of sensitive content and the relevance of the requested archives to the research topic. As part of investigating the access authorization, we perform tests using Rayton and also EPAD+ in order to verify the sensitivity and the relevance of the contents. But in this case, the request was eventually denied because its scope was too large and it was not possible for the archivist to assess the sensitivity of all the messages that could answer the request. Nevertheless, we benefited from this request as it gave us an opportunity to reflect on our means of investigating and giving access to mailboxes.
So while our mailbox preservation strategy has its limitations, it provides us with both long-term guarantees regarding preservation and the space to adapt to a wide variety of future evolutions. Of course, our reflection on that matter is still ongoing, and this workflow is meant to be perfected as we experiment with new tools and processes. We should also note that we are yet to receive an access request on one of the mailboxes processed according to this workflow, which would provide us with an opportunity to actually put it to the test of a real use case. But we already know that RECIP would be an option for access because we've just shown you how we use it for preservation purposes. But it would also allow us to import a DIP from our digital repository or to import a raw PST file for access purposes. Thank you for your attention. We'll now do our best to answer your question if you have any, and we are also looking forward to any comments you might have.
Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, guys, for a great presentation to kick things off there. So whilst people are thinking of questions, I can see that the virtual applause has already started going around the hall, so that's good. I'll just give people a chance to think of some questions and perhaps put them either, as Sarah said at the beginning, either raise your hand or unmute if you'd like to speak, or put something in the chat and we'll ask it for you. But perhaps I could kick off with a question. So of the mailboxes you've received, how do they, maybe I missed this, but how do they come to you? Do you receive them or do you plan to receive them on a regular basis, or is it down to an individual or down to an archive that gives you? How could you say a little bit more about the process that the mailboxes come to you?
So the mailboxes are generally ingested to the digital repository by mission archivists, so archivists working, for instance, in the ministries. So that's the most common way they will.
Actually, with our new digital repository implemented in 2018, archivists in missions have access to our digital repository. So they are in the office in the ministries and they can transfer the SIPs and we receive it.
Yeah, and in some very specific cases, we will get mailboxes for instance, in private archives. And in this case, the process is a little bit different because they won't come to us as already prepared, as SIPs.
So do those archivists have access to the RECIP sort of locally, and have you had to do you have to train and support them as well in the tool, or Do they know enough?
Yes. For some, yes. For some mission archivists, we had to train them, but also are very some other one are comfortable with that tool, so it's no problem. And Vitam, who developed RECIP, also organize training session with RECIP, so that works.
Okay. And I guess following on from that, I see there's a question in the chat from my colleague Jen, who's saying, is there essentially a community around RECIP that's building up? Is it being used by, I guess, other groups that you know of, or is it very much, I guess, limited to the archives you work with?
It's really adapted to the users of Vitam. So it's the same group of users than Vitam in RECIP. We have a group to ask questions, answer them if we have problems. We also have a platform to write some tickets if we had an error. So it works like that.
Yeah, but like, so the user community is pretty much the same as that of Vitam.
Yeah, and so very French.
Very French.
Okay. Okay. And also, Janet has asked, if you were to grant access to the archived emails, would you make accessible an entire mailbox, or how do you choose individual files?
That was really the purpose of the first investigation. We were really wondering if we could get access to the entire mailbox or a set of individual files. And well, when investigating the sensitivity, we've seen that there are lots of messages that were sensitive. So we try to isolate messages, but there are really too many to answer the request. So that's why we finally denied the request on this mailbox.
Yeah, so in theory, we would have liked to be able to choose the subset of messages that were both relevant to the request and non-sensitive. Unfortunately, we didn't have the technical means to do so for such a broad request.
Yes, so the question that is asked there is we don't have a firm answer to that. We are really reflecting on that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you said earlier on that when you archive emails, you archive any attachments in the original format.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So could you say a little bit more about that? I mean, isn't that going to create a problem potentially in the long term with lots of proprietary information sort of attached to files, or are you just not worrying about that for now?
Well, I think we're gonna this is the topic of the second workflow actually.
Okay.
But yeah, we have a format policy very not really.
We have a very tolerant format policy. In some specific cases, we do recommend like there are formats that we do reject, but in general, the thing is we can't really we are in a context where we can't really reject archives. We can't really we don't really have a control over what's being collected, so we can make recommendations, but our options once the archives are ingested are very limited. But with which is why we created the workflow we are going to present afterwards. So to try and answer the question, yes, there are formats we are going to recommend conversion or a different extraction for, but those are fairly limited cases, and actually the formats we firmly reject generally correspond to files with no archival value.
Yes, and for mailboxes in particular, if we begin to ask mission archivists to convert files, it will be very time consuming. This workflow, I know, is really long to implement for them, so we don't ask everything.
just going to ask this one last question before we move on to your next topic, which I'm very much looking forward to, which is very topical, I think, is about, do you think you could train an AI, an LLM, to identify and distinguish sensitive messages from non-sensitive? I guess that's in your ingest workflow. Are you looking at that?
We don't have actually that project in the National Archives, but in France there is a project called Pêle-mêle, which is actually that, training an AI.
Yeah.
So watch this space. That's what you're saying.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So thanks very much for that, guys.